Hey, team players, welcome to Local Football Flavor. Today, we're going to be breaking down our PPR wide receiver ranks. So enjoy the show. Let's get at it. All right, team players, let's reveal the rankings here. First time Bob gets to see who I ranked and where. So with me, there's a couple of key things I'm going to point out that I have different than most people's rankings. Cooper Kupp, to me, is a 100% undraftable asset. The simple fact is, getting hurt upon the leg again, I don't trust Stafford's recovery, and I know that he was one of the greatest receivers we had for a 3-year spurt. I don't think he's draftable anymore because of the injury risk. Now, Bob, I saw your reaction to some of the picks I made. Let's dive into where you have issues with me and then vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, two of the guys that you have ranked at 14 and 15, I mean, those guys are coming in the 20s for me, for sure, 100%, with Terry McLaurin over Michael Pittman. But the main problem, Joe, that I have with these two guys in your top 15 is volume, is that we don't know. It really depends on what the quarterbacks are going to do here. And a lot of people say this is the same thing about Drake London, but I would disagree to a higher level, because with the Colts here and with the Commanders, Terry McLaurin also has Jahan Dotson. We also have the receiving back in Antonio Gibson. And we also have, just a Sam Howell. We are not sure how much he's going to throw the ball. So to put him in the top 15 over quarterbacks that we know are going to throw the ball, like if you look at your rankings just in general, and you have a player in the top 15, but their quarterback is borderline undraftable, it seems to be a little bit of an issue. And now I see where you're going with the Colts thing.
We have the same situation with each of us at number 5 with Devonte Smith. So here's my answer with McLaurin is, first and foremost, you are right about Dotson also being on the roster. McLaurin, and this is also true with Pittman, are by far and away the most talented receivers on that team, pass catchers on their team, period. McLaurin is much more electric than Pittman, but the reason I have Pittman ahead of him is the gap between Pittman and number 2 in Pierce is massive. So I am more comfortable with the quarterback situation in Washington than I am in Indy if Richardson starts. I am under the belief that Richardson is not going to start. And I think one of the most underrated starting quarterbacks in week 1 is going to be Gardner Minshew. Minshew is going to be the next generation of the one who was in Washington, who went to Harvard and went everywhere with the big beard. Fitzmagic. He's going to be the next Fitzmagic. I firmly believe that. And the volume catcher with a decent quarterback in Indianapolis is going to be Michael Pittman by a fairly large margin. The Commanders are a little bit of a different story. The Commanders are in a division where they're going to have to outscore people dramatically. And McLaurin is going to be the one to do it. Now, don't get me wrong. The Commanders aren't going to win a lot of football games, but garbage time points are valuable. They're going to go to the best receiver that you have, which is McLaurin by a long shot. And that's why I believe McLaurin, even though he's not a name brand guy, he does get you volume. And since he has the ability to do after the catch, they can really take off. Remember, Washington started the year last year before Wentz imploded as one of the most electric offenses in the league. And I believe that they're
I remember that.
Doing that again. They had a bunch of games. I think they had 3 games in September where they scored more than 28 points. So just a ton of up and down garbage time points, but points nonetheless. And that's why I'm on the McLaurin bandwagon. And like I said, Pittman is 100% contingent upon the Mississippi Mudflap starting the season.
Right, and that's kind of why I say at 14, that's very high.
Hey, team players, welcome to Local Football Flavor. Today we're going to be breaking down our PPR wide receiver ranks. So enjoy the show. Let's get at it.
I mean, at a respectful maybe like 22, 23, 25, I just don't see Pittman being able to put together a better season than, let's say, Jerry Jeudy or Drake London, two guys that I really like around in that same range. And to that point as well, Terry McLaurin, while being a top-tier talent on his team, Jahan Dotson also, when he's there, he does take a lot of looks away from McLaurin. And I'm just not sold 100%. I know you've been talking about McLaurin a lot this year. He's a guy that you really like. And I know you've been talking about Pittman. He's a guy that you really like as well. I'm just not seeing the Pittman so much. I could see McLaurin maybe by the end of the year jumping up if things were to go haywire with certain players into the top 15. But I think right now, comfortably, I have him in the low 20s, whereas I have Pittman closer to like 20, maybe like 26.
Yeah, and that's fair. Like I said, I'm on him for the most part of when I look at people that you have on your list that I'm less comfortable with. Like, I am never going to sign off another check where I think Keenan Allen's going to be healthy all year. It's not happening. I do believe that the Calvin Ridley experience has a chance of being phenomenal. Mm-hmm. But I don't want to risk the complete unknown based upon a guy who quit on his team before. There's just something about that principle of quitting on your team before the suspension that I just can't get over. And that might make me, a hater or whatever. But it's something that, as a result, Calvin Ridley to me is near undraftable. Not as much as Cooper Kupp, but like near undraftable in that same way. So Bob, there are some people on your list that are a little bit different order to throw people off at the top. Mm-hmm. You don't have Chase as your default number 2, and you have Diggs flying up, where some people have him closer to 9 or 10, and you have him second. So what makes you so excited to be on the Diggs bus?
So there's kind of like a 3-part thing with Stephon Diggs here, is that we know he is the best player outside of Josh Allen in Buffalo. Okay. What we know about Diggs, and statistically speaking, one of the things that is important about Diggs is those red zone reps, right? Jamar Chase was number 1 in wide receivers in terms of red zone reps. He had 28 out of a lot of reps that because the Bengals just get into the end zone. I mean, it was a soft schedule. It was apparent that was going to happen. Diggs as well had the 4th most targets in the red zone. And so, me, I'm a really big about the red zone, but in order to get there, he was 3rd in yards run per route, right? And so we're talking about, when we think about Tyreek Hill and players like that topped off in that statistical category, Diggs has room to grow. Like I said, when you're 4th, when you're 3rd, and you still haven't put together what maybe quantifiably would be some players' best season. And so Diggs, I believe he only finished with about 8 touchdowns last year, and typically speaking, he only finishes around that. And maybe he finishes around 1,200 yards in the past. But he did finish 6th in fantasy points last year out of wide receivers. And so when I look at a wide receiver that I want to be drafting as my 2, as my 3, or as my 1, if I'm drafting in that position, I like to look for room to grow. And Stephon Diggs is the guy, in my mind, out of all of these wide receivers on this list that have the chance to be number 1 overall. Outside of Justin Jefferson, Diggs has the best ability to grow, not only statistically, but in terms of just game script and health, is that a lot of people are scared because he often disappears in the fantasy playoffs when you need him the most, where he's getting 8 points, 9 points per game. But the schedule this year in Buffalo sends them to away games at certain points in times. Now, I mean, those away games are in Kansas City, so it's not as much warmer. But we are seeing the opportunity that, Josh Allen was even not Josh Allen for a little bit last year. There was a lot of games where he just looked off. He also had a lot of turnovers. if some of those turnovers can turn into points heading towards Diggs, there's a good possibility that we could.
Hey, team players, welcome to Local Football Flavor. Today, we're going to be breaking down our PPR wide receiver ranks. So enjoy the show. Let's get at it.
See an upwards regression there, in terms of touchdowns. There's a lot of camp stories coming out about Dalton Kincaid. Dalton Kincaid could become a red zone target for them. Damian Harris is a red zone target as well in terms of just rushing the ball in the red zone. But there's no way that when the game is on the line, and there's going to be quite a few games on the line for the Bills, that Diggs is coming out of that game, that Diggs is not going to be a relevant piece to that puzzle. So whereas Diggs's yardage total might hover around maybe like 1,100, there's a good chance that the way that this Buffalo offense is constructed this year, that his touchdowns will increase. And the volume isn't going to decrease for him at all. Yeah, we didn't have a healthy Gabe Davis last year, but Gabe Davis only gets so many catches per game. He's not a volume guy. When you also go with Dalton Kincaid is still a rookie tight end. You're not going to rely on a rookie tight end when it really matters. So the camp stories are good and all for that. But people are saying, well, why not Chase over Diggs? Well, we already know that Joe Burrow is going to probably sit out at least one game. And Chase even said to Burrow, hey, I don't want you coming back until you're 100% healthy. So whether that means you're not back by week 4, that's what Chase said. And so we are seeing a player now in Chase who is not one of those prima donna wide receivers that we have seen in the past. He's showing a lot of care for his team. And when you have a player that shows care for his team, I'm going back to a couple of things with T. Higgins particularly, and you'll notice that I don't have T. Higgins on this list here. But when you talk about the Bengals, if Joe Burrow isn't there to support the Bengals, there's a good chance that both of those wide receivers start to dip a little bit in the rankings, whereas Higgins will dip a lot more than Chase will. I'm not saying that Chase, the reason I have him at 4 there, I'm not saying that he is any worse for wear, but there is a good chance that if Burrow doesn't play, that the second up for the Bengals isn't going to be nearly as profitable for Chase and Higgins at the same time.
I want to do a little pushback with there because the Bengals are starting the year at Cleveland. Cleveland doesn't have a good defense. I mean, it's just the way around it. However, they do have a pass rush. And when we look at that and say, is it going to actually hold them back? They only have one corner. It's going to be on Chase. And that's going to be Ward is their only real corner. And I look at this and say, I don't think it's going to hold back Higgins as much as you're thinking. The schedule that the AFC North plays, and the Bengals in particular, is so soft. The Bengals is very early soft. They get hard in the middle when they play Buffalo and Kansas City. But I'm not as much worried about it, and that's where, and I believe Jamar was right. Give him September off in terms of Burrow, and then go make a playoff run. That's how Cincinnati's thinking. It's actually a very good mindset from them. But I do want to ask you a question here, because you were talking about a lot in your Stephon Diggs answer about how he has the upside growth of doing more. Last year, Tyreek Hill was the 3rd most targeted receiver in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see him as being someone who can have upside growth moving forward into this season?
So for Tyreek Hill, ranking him at 3, my 3, 4, and 5 more so is that I believe that all 3 of these guys have probably hit their peak in terms of potential touchdowns that they could get on their team. Okay. Hill is kind of locked versus Waddle. Chase is locked versus Higgins. And Devonte Adams is, I don't think that we're going to see a year where he gets higher than 14 touchdowns, because that's already happened.
That's quarterback.
Yeah. And so, like, if Adams were paired up with, say, like Tua, Kirk Cousins, or even Dak, he could go for like 18. He could go for a Randy Moss type season. But we know where his ceiling is. And so ranking him at 5, I'm ranking him, whereas I'm ranking Diggs on his potential ceiling, Adams is there because he's the only show in town for the Las Vegas Raiders, right? And when you look at this team, Jimmy G isn't as bad as we had originally thought. The only thing bad about Jimmy G in terms of getting the ball down the field is his injury concerns. He has been injured a lot in the past. And so
downgraded coaching.
It is, but for Adams, he's such a special player. And in the vein as, you know, I would say that out of all of these guys, if I were to construct a team to win a Super Bowl this season, the guy I would want on my team is Devonte Adams. Yeah. Just because the eliteness that he has had through the entirety of his career. He went from Aaron Rodgers at his peak to Derek Carr at his lowest point. And the guy still put up top end wide receiver numbers. And if we don't have a Justin Jefferson, we're talking about Devonte Adams, right? And that's the thing that you have to be careful is when you're drafting players at their ceiling, is that I'm not drafting Devonte Adams in the first round. Just like to clarify.
What about Tyreek?
Okay, so I'm going to get there. But Devonte Adams, I'm drafting him at the top end of the second round. But if I've got a top end pick and I want Devonte Adams, I'm not going to say no to taking him because he's super elite in that regard. But you're just going to have to play in your team a little bit differently. Say you're drafting at 7 and you want Devonte Adams, he's not coming back to you at the turn, because if you're in a 12-team league, he's definitely not coming back. In a 10-team league, there's a good chance that he might. But if you're drafting 7 and you want Adams, you're going to have to take him there. And you're not. I don't think you're going to be disappointed so far, but I think those numbers are going to come down from last year, but you're still getting an elite player with minimal question marks athletically. You just only have those question marks at the quarterback. And if Jimmy G is healthy, then there is no questions at quarterback. He's going to get the ball, and there's going to be a lot of garbage time for Oakland. He's going to get the ball. He's going to see the field. And not in Oakland, in Vegas. And if Vegas decides to trade him later down the line at the deadline for whatever reason, he's just going to go to a better team. And so the fact is that Devonte Adams is set up to replicate his season that he had last year, with maybe a few less touchdowns. Maybe you're looking at 10. Maybe you're looking at 1,200 yards or 1,100 yards and 12 touchdowns or 10 touchdowns. And that's still a wide receiver 1 number. So I think that needs to be put out there. And for Tyreek Hill, Tyreek Hill is one of those guys that, like Diggs and like Adams and like Chase and Jefferson to less of a degree because we haven't seen him play with another quarterback, he seems to be quarterback proof. No matter what quarterback they're starting, they know that Hill is their best chance to win the game. The only reason why Hill's touchdown numbers might not surpass Adams or surpass CD or Diggs is because Waddle is in town, and Waddle is definitely a red zone target. He's definitely a threat. I mean, like Hill, for example, I mean, you're not sleeping on him in the red zone. But the problem with Hill versus, say, Adams or Diggs is that I don't think Gabe Davis is much of a threat. I don't think Dalton Kincaid is much of a threat. But Waddle is. And I'm not going to dip Tyreek Hill any lower than, say, 6, where I have Kupp at. But I think his talent level would make me want... I mean, to be honest with you, I've owned in fantasy leagues Diggs, Hill, and Adams over the course of the last couple of years. And I was winning games. And when they're on the field, they're staying on the field. They're not getting taken out. Now, to your point about Tua is Hill's best chance to get 2,000 yards this season. If Tua goes out, I don't see it happening with Mike White. And that's one of the...
Hey, team players, welcome to Local Football Flavor. Today, we're going to be breaking down our PPR wide receiver ranks. So enjoy the show. Let's get at it.
The reasons why I put him behind Diggs, but I still have him above Jamar Chase, which seems a little bit strange to most people. But I really do think there's something about Chase this year that's putting him more so in that 9-10 touchdowns, 1,300 yards kind of mind, whereas I think Hill, Diggs, and Jefferson could surpass that in the long term.
And that's fair. So as I look at mine here, I obviously have Waddle ahead of Hill. I have Hill in the 7th spot. And there's a couple of important facts that I want to bring out here. And if you look at last season, Kyle Shanahan and his protege down in Miami collectively used 8 quarterbacks last year. They are not exactly what you would call a quarterback-safe environment. And with everything we look at Miami's build of their roster, Mike White is horrendous. If they go through the same thing as last year and have to go to the backup of Mike White, I don't see a way where Tyreek Hill will ever have an opportunity to go and get those 180 targets again. The second reason I'm against Tyreek is 180 targets is way too much for a small receiver. And as soon as someone catches him, he's going to break. They use him as a possession receiver, and I don't believe that is conducive to his long run, given the fact that the coach doesn't really care about the health of his players, as we all can remember Tua looking like Muhammad Ali on Thursday Night Football. So that's point 2. And point 3, which maybe was burying the lead, I believe that Tyreek Hill, as soon as he loses a step, will not be a good receiver. And I think Jalen Waddle has the potential of stepping up to being the best receiver on the team. And it's due to the evolution of their route trees. Tyreek Hill essentially runs deep outs, deep comebacks, and screens. That's basically his game. Waddle runs a complete and diverse route tree. So when it comes time to using the red zone and the field is limited, you can't just run over the top, Waddle is going to be the go-to guy more and more as the season progresses, regardless of who the quarterback is. I firmly believe by the end of this season, Waddle's trajectory will be much higher than Hill, and he will have surpassed Hill, which is why I have Jalen Waddle as my 6th spot and Hill beneath him. I'm under the impression and the belief that Hill is going to get hurt this year. But if he doesn't, that's why I have him in the 7th spot, because he is still a crazy talent from a fantasy perspective.
Oh, yeah.
But if he gets hurt, he shouldn't be on your top 10. Because when I say he get hurt, I'm not.
Well, I mean, you can
have the career.
You can say that about any of these guys, though. If they get hurt, you know.
Think about him. The body math and the volume he gets has never added up for a small receiver in terms of the target share he's getting. It's never worked before, and on top of it, his coach doesn't value his players' health.
I mean,
to your math, that sounds like disaster to me.
To your point, that, you know, with Tyreek Hill and Waddle, is that team is explosive enough to be able to support 2 wide receivers, similar to the Bengals. That, you know, if they're to find the running game that, you know, they want to find this year with Devin Achane, with other guys, you could probably see these numbers for both Hill and Waddle dipping a little bit. And where you're drafting Waddle versus where you're drafting Hill, you can afford a little bit of dip in the numbers. When you're drafting Hill, where you're drafting him at usually at 4, maybe at 7 overall, you have to make that decision if you want Eckler, McCaffrey, Kelsey, and the like. But you're investing a lot in Tyreek Hill. And one of the things that about going to your point about Waddle here, you'll notice I don't have Waddle on my top 15. Or I do. He's 12. So when I have him at 12, it's that I think there are a couple of guys in the league better than him at this moment in time. One of them being Chris Olave. You know, both of us are really high on Chris Olave this year, and I'm actually surprised that you don't have Olave above Waddle. for Olave to succeed, there's a lot less things that need to happen. But for Waddle to succeed at the level of surpassing Hill's numbers, there's a lot of things that have to happen. And I think that for me, Waddle is perfectly settled into that back end second round. I really like where he's at, and despite the injury that happened to him, we don't know what's going on there. It seems to just be maybe an oblique strain or something like that. But Waddle is valued strictly at that point. But I could see, like to your point, by the end of the year, him being the sixth best wide receiver in the NFL. There's a very good chance that he could succeed in that way, because even without Hill, we saw as a rookie that he was capable of putting up really, really good numbers. And I could see that happening again. And so I think for me, though, I would rather have CD, Amah, and Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave over Jalen Waddle on my fantasy team at that point for a couple different reasons. With Amon-Ra, he had a really high targeted rate, so 32%. And at the same point in time, that only trailed Tyreek Hill, by the way. So he was targeted one of the highest rates of any wide receiver in the NFL. And he has a top 10 schedule in terms of fantasy production. And so
the NFC North does not defend the pass. They just
when you look at it from just a ranking standpoint, you're looking at Amon-Ra going in the usually around that where you're drafting at 8 on the comeback of 8, 7, 6, somewhere in there. You might see him at the comeback of where the 2-5 position would be, or the 2-8 position. So coming back around that way, Amon-Ra has an extreme amount of value this year because we have yet again another season where he's the top target on a wide receiving core that pretty much is a nameless wide receiver core until Jameson Williams comes back, potentially in week 6. Now, with Jameson Williams, we don't know who he is as a player yet. There's a good chance that he could be a bust at this point in time in his career. But Amon-Ra is supporting that cast. And for the same reason that you believe Tyreek Hill as being a danger in terms of injury, I think out of all of these wide receivers outside of Cooper Kupp and Keenan Allen to be injured this year, I think Amon-Ra has the biggest chance to get injured out of any of these wide receivers. He's been hurt before. He's been hurt before. He's overused. But in his overuse, he has been putting up good fantasy numbers. And I think what will set Amon-Ra up for a better season will be a more efficient season, because there's a lot of times where, and this is the same thing that a lot of people are saying against Debo, which is a very big problem for Debo, but not so much for Amon-Ra because he does get it down the field a lot too, is that there's in that 4 to 5 yard range, Amon-Ra catches a lot of balls, and he's turning it upfield. But there's a good chance that if he keeps doing that there's a better chance that he gets injured, because he is really the only realistic threat in the passing game outside of maybe Sam Laporta. Again, camp news for a rookie tight end. We need to see a little bit more, but out of Amon-Ra, I think that he has a lot of upward momentum to do better. And that is why he's at my 8 slot and over Jalen Waddle, because I think that he's not being handicapped by anything other than his own self, his injuries. Same to go with Garrett Wilson.
With Amon, there is also the fact that Jared Goff is a completely different quarterback when he's not in a dome, particularly the Ford Field dome. So that's something that has to be noted. Yes, and to dive into that fact, it does correlate to Amon missed more road games than home games when he was hurt. So it's actually a bigger testament to you, Bob, saying that how important Amon is to the passing game in Detroit. He is the answer, especially after they traded Hawkinson last year. He was the only name in town. And we look at the way that they built the team this year. Gibbs is probably a running the ball upgrade over the combination of running backs they had last year, but he's not the same receiving threat that Swift was. And so when we look at this, the actual percentage of the burden falling upon Amon St. Brown is just going up. So I look at this overall, and I agree with you, Bob, in saying that Amon's there. I obviously have him 10th, but I can't ignore the injury risk at the door, and it's kind of the same way I look at Kyler Murray. When he's on the field, he's unproduced, but will he be there in the playoffs when it matters? And with Amon, I'm worried about that. Which go down our rankings lower, which aren't necessarily in this episode, is why I like Williams more than you. Yes, Williams is a complete unknown in terms of what he can actually do, but I know it's going to be helpful in the playoffs. So snagging him in a late round, to me, is essentially Amon insurance.
Yeah, and to just the last point about Amon-Ra here is that as the season went on and Jared Goff found his groove and he was less hurt, the numbers got better, but we still weren't talking about like elite production. So like if you take a look at it, he had 106 catches on 146 targets. So that's 106 points in PPR right off the rip. His yardage total was 1,161, which is not so much different than T. Higgins, who in 10-team leagues is slipping down into the 3rd and the 4th round. He had 6 touchdowns as well. Jamal Williams was used almost exclusively in the red zone, which took away a lot of the opportunities that Amon-Ra had or would have in the red zone. So you have to ask yourself.
Obsessed with him breaking the touchdown record, and Amon was very hurt by that.
And you look back, and you just look back at his numbers from the year prior when Jamal Williams wasn't the dude or the guy there. He had 90 receptions for 912 yards and 5 touchdowns. So his yards per route was like 10, 11. So he's used almost exclusively between the numbers there, and you're not getting a lot of red zone potential from him. And so if you think that Amon-Ra is going to elevate himself more, what has to happen is it has to turn into red zone targets, and he has to get touches in that red zone a lot more. And I don't know if that's actually going to happen because David Montgomery's there. We know that they like Sam Laporta. There's a very good chance that it could happen. But I'm just not sold 100% yet on that. But I do think that him and Garrett Wilson, to that degree, are 2 players where their quarterback's health and their quarterback's ability will lead them to success this year. And you could probably see both of these guys trending by the end of the season in that 1,300-yard range with about 6 or 7 touchdowns apiece. And that is perfectly what we want out of a second-round wide receiver. Maybe he'll be your wide receiver 1. Maybe he'll be your wide receiver 2. But I think in a 10-team league, you've got to get one of these top 15 guys to start your roster with. Because if you don't, you're setting yourself up to play a lot of guessing games. And I think that the top 10, particularly out of the guys that we have, there's minimal question marks in those guys. And you've got to get one of them.
Back on the one you just brought up here, which is Garrett Wilson. To me, Garrett Wilson is the wild card of all of this. Because he's a great rookie year. No one's fighting that. And he showed a lot of great potential there. But his quarterback is the biggest wild card nut job in the NFL right now. I mean, let's just call it the way it is. He has a broken thumb for 3/4 of the year last year, doesn't disclose it, and we know how he is if he doesn't like you. You can be the most talented person on the field, and he won't give you the ball. Christian Watson literally scored a touchdown every 4th time he was given the ball. 1 out of 4 times I get this guy he gets a touchdown. And Rodgers wouldn't do it. So Garrett Wilson, to me, could end the league being wide receiver 1. He could end the league being wide receiver 30. And it's all because of the headspace of Aaron Rodgers, which I do not like playing those guessing games. To me, that's why I put him there at 11 after Ahmad, or everything we just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Garrett Wilson, to me, again, talented enough in a situation that could elevate enough that it's not out of the world he could be receiver one.
Mm-hmm.
However, I am not comfortable having him be my receiver one on my fantasy team. If I have someone as
I see that.
Devonte Adams and paired with Garrett Wilson, I would love that because I know that I'm going to get the stability of an Adams and then a Garrett Wilson upside explosion. It's great. Long story short, Garrett Wilson as my number 2 receiver could be amazing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Rely on him and say, I'm just going to take one receiver and then I'm going to do the Keller code for the first 4 rounds. I'm going to take, try to get a Kelsey build with Wilson and then a quarterback and a running back. That would leave me very scared moving forward with Wilson having to be relied upon as my only receiver in the first 5 rounds.
And I see that. And people are saying, Garrett Wilson was quarterback proof last year. He had a lot of shitty quarterbacks. I disagree with that statement. Out of all these guys that I have ranked in the top 10 here, the number 9 with Garrett Wilson only had like 83 receptions last year. And he had 1,100 yards on 83 receptions. There was a couple of games where he had like 12 yards, 14 yards, 22 yards, which isn't good. And that's not what you want. However, when we have seen wide receivers, the reason that Garrett Wilson is not being used in the same conversation as T. Higgins or DK Metcalf or even, Calvin Ridley and Devonta Smith is that people have so much respect for Aaron Rodgers. I am not one of those people. However, it is undeniable the ability that Aaron Rodgers has to move the ball with an offense that is good. We've seen it. We've seen him be successful with Devonte Adams. We've seen him be successful to a degree with Christian Watson. We've seen him use players in, just getting them the ball in space so that they can use their natural talents to get it downfield. So Garrett Wilson has a lot of room to grow. There's a good chance that Garrett Wilson could get past that 100 yard or 100 receptions, could go up to like 110, 115. So that would be like 30 more receptions than he had last year. There is no doubt in my mind that even though the Jets have hired Hackett, that Aaron Rodgers will supersede every single decision that he will make. Whereas Russell Wilson didn't so much because he was the head coach, but knowing that he's a coordinator and knowing that Aaron Rodgers is a legendary Hall of Famer, we saw Ben Roethlisberger just doing whatever he wanted, which wasn't always a good thing for the Pittsburgh Steelers.
That's my point.
But Aaron Rodgers, to get the ball, they're going to make plays to get the ball to Garrett Wilson. They're not going to make plays to get the ball to Mecole Hardman. They're not going to make plays to get the ball to Allen Lazard. However, this is the interesting thing to like throw out is those touchdown numbers. Is that if Garrett Wilson is going to cement himself as a wide receiver 1 for fantasy purposes in fantasy, that 6 touchdowns has to go up to at least 8 by the end of this season. And you would want him to at least show you that he could get 12. For the sheer fact that we know that in order to be the elite of the elite, you have to have the capability to get at least 10 touchdowns. And so Garrett Wilson and Amon-Ra are almost in that same vein for me, is that I'm scared for their touchdown numbers, but not for their volume. I think their volume is going to continue to be there. I think they're going to continue to be players that move the ball downfield. But for some reason or another, I have a sinking feeling, particularly about Amon-Ra, that those touchdown numbers aren't going to grow as much as, say, Garrett Wilson's touchdown numbers can grow. But at the same point in time, which one would I feel more comfortable with going into the season as a number one wide receiver if you took a running back or a tight end in the first round? I'm not so sure I want either of them as my number one wide receiver. But if I do have one of them as my number one wide receiver, that does mean that I've took an elite talent elsewhere, which makes it
another receiver very quickly to protect yourself.
Yeah, which means that I am perfectly fine if, by a team construction standpoint, let's just say I've taken Saquon Barkley in the first round at 1.7, 1.8, somewhere around there. I come back around, I take Amon-Ra St. Brown as my wide receiver one in the second round. Then coming back again in the third round, there's a very high potential that you could see a couple of these top 15 wide receivers still snake their way back down there, because you're going to have a Patrick Mahomes somewhere in there. You're going to have a Jalen Hurts somewhere in there. Yeah. You're going to have a Mark Andrews, and you're going to have a lot of running backs. You're going to have a Ramondre Stevenson. You're going to have a Najee Harris. And there's a lot to be said, though, too, Joe, in starting with two wide receivers as opposed to running back wide receiver. We've been preaching and saying, it's important to get a running back out of those first 3 rounds, possibly even 2. But I'll tell you this, if I'm at 7, okay, and I have the opportunity for the likes of Stephon Diggs to be my number 1, come back around and get Amon-Ra as my 2, and then come back and get a steady, albeit, questionable also in terms of touchdown production, Najee Harris as my number 1 running back, I would go into the season feeling a little bit better, because all 3 of those players have the potential to get more touchdowns this year than they had in the past. And ideally, that's what you're projecting forward. And their schedules aren't that bad overall. I mean, granted, Bills have to play the Jets twice and New England twice, but they had to do that last year too. And they had to do that when they were good last year too, and Diggs didn't do that bad last year either. Now, getting into a couple of these guys from the 10 to 15 range, for me, I have Keenan Allen as my 15th ranked player in terms of wide receivers. And it's from the sheer fact that when he came back, he's putting up wide receiver 4 numbers, right? So when he came back and and he was healthy, he was wide receiver 4 from that point on from his comeback. And we're looking at a team with Justin Herbert, which we assume is a healthy Justin Herbert. And if all players are healthy, there is a very realistic chance that we could see Keenan Allen perform above his expected ADP, which is hovering in the 3rd, 4th round, somewhere in there. Same thing goes for Calvin Ridley. His ADP is now in the 3rd, 4th round. And if you're taking one of these 2 guys and you've already have a potentially elite option as your number 1 already, say you already took Diggs, taking a chance on Ridley or Allen is not going to submarine your team. You're going to have to be careful going through the rest of your roster. But when I say the importance of taking a top flight wide receiver can't be understated here, because if I go running back, or running back, quarterback, or running back, quarterback, running back, or any of those other combinations, and I'm rolling into the season with Calvin Ridley or Keenan Allen as my choices as my wide receiver 1 and my wide receiver 2, there's a lot of question marks there that the other guys just simply do not have. And you could be going through a lot of up and down weeks, but in that same regard, there's a very realistic possibility that Calvin Ridley finishes the season with 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns, which would put him back into that conversation as being a 2nd-round wide receiver. There's a very realistic possibility that Keenan Allen finishes with like 110 receptions, 912 yards, and 10 touchdowns, because he might be used a little bit more in the red zone. Who knows? We have never seen a fully healthy team with Justin Herbert. So we don't know realistically what is going to happen, because at any one point in time, one person has been hurt or another person has been hurt. And I will say, to your point that you made about Mike Williams earlier, that Mike Williams is an incredibly volatile but very, very valuable asset, because he is used to move the ball downfield. He is big and can get it into the red zone. He's a big target in the red zone. And so if you like Mike Williams, you're not going to take a chance on a guy that has a little bit more question marks, like maybe Calvin Ridley or Keenan Allen. So your third round, fourth round options, you're going to be sitting there thinking, well, do I want to take a chance on Travis Etienne, Jahmyr Gibbs, Najee Harris? Do I want a quarterback? Do I want to go with Mark Andrews or George Kittle? And you have a lot of, do I want a guy like Amari Cooper? So out of the guys that I would have in that 15 to 20 range, and you know, just to take a look at the guys that potentially are there, you're looking at Amari Cooper, you're looking at DK Metcalf, you're looking at Deebo Samuel, who I'm out completely on, Chris Godwin, and then you start to get DeAndre Hopkins, Jerry Jeudy. And I've got to say, out of all of those guys outside of London and Jeudy, Ridley and Allen are the two that I like, but I only like them if I'm able to get a wide receiver ahead of them as well.
Yeah, I got it. So they're able to be number two. But the one thing that Allen that needs to be pointed out is that while the Chargers may end up being one of the highest scoring teams in the NFL overall in terms of points scored in the league, Keenan Allen has never been part of the touchdown bandwagon with the Chargers. It has been Eckler or Williams pretty much predominantly. You look through the amount of percentage of touchdown Allen gets, it's very small. And in a standard league, Allen is nowhere near anyone's top 50. This is a PPR exclusive thing because he is a volume man there. And it's one of the things that I really like about him. Now, Bob,
to your point, Joe, he, for me this year, if you go back to his best season where he's played in 16 games, if you go back towards his best seasons, and I'm going to take 2019 and 2021 as an example here, because he did play 14 games in 2020 as well. In 2021, he had 106 receptions, 2019, 104 receptions. In each one of those years, he got over 1,100 yards. And in each one of those years, he got 6 touchdowns, which, if you think about it, that is exactly why Garrett Wilson is in that top tier. That's exactly the numbers that you're looking at out of Amon-Ra, but you're getting Keenan Allen in the third or fourth round. So if you're a running back heavy guy and you want to take Barkley and Taylor, or you want to go Kelsey and, if you could get Chubb on the return there, Keenan Allen is a perfectly acceptable option for you, because even in a year where he only played 10 games, he had 66 receptions for 752 yards, which puts him around that same vein of mine where we had like Christian Watson and guys like that, where those touchdowns aren't going to really move much, 6 to 8. But it's that receptions and that yardage total that's going to elevate him to the next level. And the same things to go with Calvin Ridley. Calvin Ridley is a touchdown hog. And I'm projecting that Christian Kirk is going to get a lot of volume, as is Calvin Ridley, but Christian Kirk might not be used as much in the red zone as he was last year, whereas Ridley should be used a little bit more in the red zone. And that's why I would bump Etienne way down my boards, who is another third-round guy that you could potentially think about taking here in 12-team leagues. So a lot of my rankings as well is also based on where I can get the guy, where I would draft the guy. So when you have 15 at Terry McLaurin you can get 5th, 6th round if you've taken wide receivers, or if you've taken running backs the whole way through. And say you may have started off and you've taken Amon-Ra and Terry McLaurin, you're not looking to get a lot of touchdowns out of those guys. You're looking for volume. And in PPR, that's not entirely bad, but I do want a little bit of that touchdown upside. And that's really what sets wide receivers 1 through 7 for me ahead of everybody else, is that they have a very high touchdown upside, whereas everybody else I feel is in that 6 to 8 range on a very good season.
Well, let's talk about one of the guys we both have in our top 7 here that we really haven't touched upon yet, and that's CeeDee Lamb. CeeDee Lamb here, I have as the number 3 receiver when it's going to be all said and done. You have him as 7, so some little variation here. Both clearly as a top tier guy. And since I have him higher, I guess I'll do the sales pitch a little more on him. Is the Cowboys last year recognized that putting CeeDee Lamb in every single position of wide receiver. Sorry about that. Last year, the Cowboys recognized putting CeeDee Lamb across the board in all 3 receiving positions might have actually been detrimental. And the reason they did that was early in the year, the Cowboys had a lot of turnover and problems at that second and third receiver depth spot on their roster. They solved that this year by bringing in Cooks. And what that's going to allow is CeeDee to play the same role, play in and play out, and allowing him to become much more specialized. I believe that in terms of growth from last season to this year, CeeDee is one of these guys who is incredibly primed to do it, but the difference between the other guys that are primed, like Garrett Wilson, for example, is that CeeDee Lamb we know already has a huge, strong foundation and floor. CeeDee Lamb is the possibility of becoming number 1 in a standard and a PPR league because he is the red zone threat down there. They got rid of Zeke, who was the red zone, basically vulture for you. Pollard isn't that type of running back. And since they don't have Schultz, CeeDee essentially is the obvious and best and possibly uncoverable red zone target in Dallas. And I think that there's a good chance the Cowboys come pretty close, if not outright, leading the NFL in points again. So I think that it's a great situation for CeeDee, and it could be awesome.
So he's grown in every single season. Hi, Joey.
Someone got a haircut today, Bob.
Wow, looking good. You look fly. You ever hear that song, Pretty Fly for a White Guy? Your haircut looks great. What are you up to today? You doing something fun today?
Gonna go for a nap
now. Ooh, a nap.
There.
You gotta go see him.
Go see Mr. Bear.
Go see Mr. Bear.
Say bye, Bob.
Bye, Joey. Hey, Trees. Bye, Joey. Keep that fresh cut fresh.
Throw it to Mom. Good job. Say bye, Bob.
Bye, Joey.
All right, Bob, you're going to need to restart your CeeDee Lamb answer. CeeDee Lamb.
Okay. So CeeDee Lamb is one of those players that has grown from year to year. When you look at his growth potential, he went from, catching 73 balls, moving up to 100. There's a very good chance when you think about players that have room to grow, CeeDee Lamb is one of those guys that is top notch, probably ahead of Hill and, ahead of Chase in terms of growth potential. The only thing standing in CeeDee Lamb's way, there's 2 things. One, being the strength of schedule. He has the 30th ranked schedule in terms for wide receivers, which is rated as one of the hardest schedules for wide receivers in the NFL. Mm-hmm. And 2 is Dak. And you have to ask yourself, and this is one of the reasons why I like Dak, but at the same time, Dak's not getting drafted in the top 9 of quarterbacks, is because on a week-to-week basis, we don't know what Dak we're going to get. Are we going to get the Dak Prescott that can throw for potentially 4 or 5 touchdowns? Or are we going to get the Dak that's going to be a turnover machine? And that has been something, a knock against Dak for almost the entirety of his career in the league. Cooks as a very credible number 2 and a healthy Gallup coming back with Tony Pollard, who is a good pass catching back and could be an elite talent for them this year. All of those signs point to CeeDee Lamb putting together a better season than he had last year. And better than last year would have to be 1,500 yards, 10 to 11 touchdowns. And he's getting drafted in that same range as Stephon Diggs is. So you're looking at him and you're comparing him and you're saying, well, do I want Chubb, Barkley, Bijan, Kelsey, CD, Diggs? Somewhere in that regard, you're mentioning his name. And out of all of the players on this list, he has that biggest potential to go from where his ADP is at, 7th overall, 8th overall, 9th overall, to, I have to go inside. It's raining. Hold on. I can just hear the rain as it's falling. Let me go. It's going to be good for the tomato plants that aren't growing. So,
okay. Well, you have a lot of tomato plants all over that.
We have 3. The other lady has that garden, so. All right. Let me get into a position here. Let me turn on the lights. 1 minute. All right. Okay. This chair's a little bit higher, so I gotta move this. Okay. All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Let me change my sitting position. Perfect. Okay. So when we look at CeeDee Lamb and you want to think about, where should I rank him? Where should he be at in my rankings list here? I think CeeDee Lamb, if you don't like Cooper Kupp because of his injury concern, and it's a very real problem, and the only reason that Kupp is ranked ahead of CeeDee Lamb for me is because we know that if Kupp is healthy, that he is the biggest threat in the NFL in terms of fantasy production to be the number 1 overall player. And when you look at the number 1 overall player, Justin Jefferson, Christian McCaffrey, Cooper Kupp are guys that we have seen do that in the past couple of years. And so I can't put him any less and I can't leave him off my board, but I won't be drafting him just because I am very concerned about that injury. And it could come back to bite you. Passing on the number 1 overall player when you have the 7th, 8th, 9th pick, that could be deadly. But I think that CeeDee Lamb could easily surpass in terms of production if he can get past that hard schedule. And that's a Dak thing. It's not a CD thing. That's a Dak thing. And one of the other players on our list that we have a little bit of a variation to, but not so much, is A.J. Brown. Mm-hmm. And then we have Devonta Smith, who you don't have ranked, and I have ranked at 14th here. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we know about the Eagles last year is that their coaching staff was incredible.
Yes.
There has now been a turnover in both offensive coordinator and I believe in defensive coordinator as well. But particularly when we look at the offense and we look at the way that Jalen Hurts played, Jalen Hurts was out of his mind in terms of just getting the ball to A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith over the course of the season. Now, Devonta Smith, his ceiling is locked by A.J. Brown, similarly to Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and Waddle and Hill. But their ceilings are so much higher, I feel, than a couple of these other player combinations, just because, A.J. Brown had 11 touchdowns last year. I believe Devonta Smith had 6 or 7 last year. And their yardage totals were insane. And that's with playing the schedule that they played last year. The NFC East wasn't the very best of times sometimes, but they were elite. And their production, and one of the things why I have A.J. Brown below Chris Olave is that I think his peak was last year in terms of what is his ceiling? What can he get to? 11 touchdowns. He got to 11 touchdowns last year. He got that back in Tennessee as well, 11 touchdowns. He was able to get 1,400 yards. I don't believe we're going to see him get any more than that. And that puts a real handicap on him in terms of where I'm drafting him. I've seen him go from as early as 9th overall to as late as back end of the second round, usually after the 6th pick picks. So that 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 at the back end of the round. And the reason why is the Devonta Smith paradox is which one of these guys will Jalen Hurts get the ball to in any one game? And if he gets them to both of them, which one's going to get the touchdowns? And you could easily see that pendulum swing to Devonta Smith's favor, or you could easily see that pendulum swing to A.J. Brown's favor. And when you're playing the odds, and this is one of the reasons why also I have Chase a little bit lower, is that if I'm drafting 3rd or 4th overall, typically speaking in a 12-team league, T. Higgins will be there for me on the comeback. Do I want to try to take a chance on T. Higgins, right? Similarly with A.J. Brown, if I draft A.J. Brown, coming back around, if in a 10-team league, if Devonta Smith is still there, I can't bring myself to take him, because if for some reason Philadelphia has a bad week, you are now submarining your whole entire team. But if Philadelphia has a very good week, you are winning most likely. And that's the damage where you have two guys from the same team, Hill and Waddle, Chase and Higgins, Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown. When you look at these other guys, realistically, there's no other, if I'm taking Calvin Ridley, taking Kirk in the back end isn't going to hurt my team much. So I could do that. Taking Diggs and Gabe Davis, that's not going to cost me a lot. Jefferson and Addison, same thing. Wilson, Lazard. If you want any part of those offenses, it's not going to cost you as much as this would, and it's going to prevent, and your decision making is going to be a little bit foggy, because you're like, well, should I just take him? He is the best value there from a team construction standpoint. Is this a good idea? And I don't think it is, and that's why ranking these guys that are ahead, like A.J. Brown, Tyreek Hill, and Jamar Chase, is so tricky, because those number two options are at times better than the number one. And that's kind of just
let's put a point on that. Is there's only 3 teams in the entire NFL that can support 2 receivers. And we look at it. It's Cincinnati, Miami, and Philly. That was it. Brady used to be able to do it when he was at Tampa. They can't even support 1. So when we look at this, it's a very hard thread for the NFL in real life to make 2 quality top 10 receivers. It's very impossible. San Diego hasn't even been able to do it, and they have Herbert. So Mahomes has never done this. Allen has never done this. It's something that's very hard, and why, to your point, why you should not draft 2 receivers from the same team. Believe you're going to snag the right one and go from there. So from my standpoint, I'm on A.J. Brown, because for PPR especially, because he's the bigger volume guy. And when the touchdown amount is kind of unknown, just give me the guy who I know is going to get more catches, and then therefore if the touchdowns end up being basically a push, well, then I win with A.J. Brown. Obviously, it's why he's more expensive in your drafts than Devonta Smith. And this is not to diminish anything with Smith. I've had him since he was a rookie. I was enamored that he won the Heisman. I think Devonta Smith is amazing. The fear that I have with him and why he's not in my top 15, aside from the fact that I love Pittman and McLaurin, is that Philadelphia is just ignoring the fact they replaced their left back. Like, to me, that is a giant glaring concern, NFL big picture problem, and they think that it's not going to be an issue. But of the 2 of them, if it does, and deeper pass protection is the bigger problem, A.J. Brown catches the shorter routes than Devonta Smith. So if there is a pocket problem in Philadelphia, Brown has that extra layer of being safe. But also, on the same token, if they can get it to him, on passes thrown their direction, Smith brings in more touchdowns on a per-pass basis than Brown does. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at the Philadelphia experiment here, as far as which way you want to go. And that offense overall is primed to cook it again. I mean, it's the most balanced offense in the NFL, and they're going to put up total points. And anytime you're in a league that's going to be scoring points, give me a piece of that. Give me a piece of that NFL offense that's going to do it. And we know that the 3 safest bets for getting part of the Eagles' chain are the 2 receivers and the quarterback. So I completely understand where you're at putting Smith in your 14 spot. Obviously, I didn't, but I think that talking about A.J. Brown is something important. Now, Bob, unless I'm missing something, we spent time on essentially every receiver on our list through the past couple of episodes here, with the exception of the big man in New Orleans, who is having a situation Chris Olave is he going to be given the reins forever now that Michael Thomas might be back? How should we view the Chris Olave situation, given the fact that Derek Carr did not have the greatest season in the world last year, didn't get to finish the season, but didn't have the greatest statistical situation? How do we look at Olave moving forward? I have him 8, you have him 10.
So I really like Olave. I really like the idea of Olave. I really like thinking about how Derek Carr could elevate his game to the next level. And there is a very real possibility that when you look at Chris Olave, that he could exceed all of the expectations that we have for him over the course of this football season. And when I go back and I look at and I say, well, where was he statistically last year? I'm going to pause there because I need to look it up. I'm not going to make anybody see there. All right, so we're going to go to stats.
So it's easy for me to catch it.
Yeah. All right, so for Chris Olave, when we look at his stats from last year, his rookie season, 72 receptions on 119 targets with 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns. He was targeted in longer passes, so he had an average of 14.5 and a long of 53, right? So you're looking at it and you say, okay, his air yards are there. The target share, 25%, which is not what you really want. It's not great. 6th in yards per route run, all this is coming from Fantasy Pros, and 8th in targets per route run. And so he's out there on the field. He's running a lot of plays, but they weren't throwing him the ball as much last year. You're looking at 73 receptions, and he eclipsed with 1,000 yards. And so I'm going to go back to the Keenan Allen comparison that I made too, where Keenan Allen had 60 or 66, and he only got 742 yards. Olave's doing that and got 1,000. And so you're seeing the difference between a guy like Olave and Keenan Allen, whereas Keenan Allen, there's a little bit more protection for him because he's been hurt. He's a little bit older. But Olave is are they going to open the doors for Olave this year is the biggest question, because if he can elevate his game and from that Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave level, because again, their reception totals are about the same. Their yardage totals are essentially the same there, and the touchdown totals are essentially nearby. If Chris Olave is able to elevate in any one of those categories, you're going to see him be a top playmaker here for fantasy purposes. 73 receptions, that in a year with Derek Carr, where we saw a down Derek Carr pass it to Devonte Adams, 140 some times. Mm-hmm. Even if
that was just completion, he targeted 108.
Yeah, even if you split up those targets between Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed, and Chris Olave, there's a very real possibility that Olave could get to 90 to 100 receptions. And with 90 to 100 receptions, you're looking at an incredible amount of yards that he could get. You're going to look at potentially more touchdowns that he could get, because let's think about what New Orleans has. New Orleans has Kareem Hunt potentially coming to back up Kamara and Jamal Williams, and they have Kendre Miller. So there's about 4 running backs there that are good. So that's going to be kind of messy. You want to stay away from that backfield. Now, in terms of wide receivers and tight ends, Juwan Johnson saw a lot of looks in the red zone. You have Taysom Hill that saw some looks in the red zone. You have Michael Thomas when he was healthy that got some looks in the red zone. Rashid Shaheed never really got a look in the red zones because he's going to stretch the field for you. So what you really are looking for out of Olave is for those touchdowns to increase. Mm-hmm. And you've got to ask yourself, is it possible that that happens this year? And this is why I have him behind Garrett Wilson. I love Chris Olave, but I want those numbers to go up in terms of the touchdowns. I want him to go to 7, 8, 9. But I just don't think it's going to happen, particularly with the amount of players that they have that are very capable players to score touchdowns. And I put him in that same range as A.J. Brown and Waddle because the target share could swing one way or the other on any of those three guys. And you could see them maybe suffering a little bit more if they're not efficient in what they need to do, with A.J. Brown being the most efficient out of the three, most likely. So you've got some question marks in terms of what am I going to do with my targets? But the talent is leaps and bounds ahead of where coming out, those two rookie wide receivers last year in Wilson and Olave, if they're able to elevate their game in any one category, whether that's receptions, especially in receptions, if they up that category, if the ball gets thrown to them more, you're going to see a real, a climb in yards. But are the touchdowns going to be there? And if I'm rolling with Chris Olave or Wilson, I would most likely like to take them as my second wide receiver, which would then put either Hill or Chase as my number one, Chris Olave on the comeback, Garrett Wilson on the comeback, because typically those guys are going in that range. But I have seen Olave go over Wilson. I have seen Wilson go over Olave a lot of times, especially in that range where you might have been drafted 6, 7, and 8. And so when it comes to that, you're looking at, is there going to be positive regression, like I said about Stephon Diggs and like I said about Amon-Ra? These four guys, Diggs, Brown, Wilson, and Olave, have the best chance to see a positive regression in their touchdown numbers out of this top 15 group, top 20 group, because it's not too hard to see him climb from 4 to 6, let's face it. And it's not too unrealistic to see someone climb from 6 to 8. But for somebody to go from like 10 to 12 or from 11 to 13, like A.J. Brown, I see those touchdown numbers coming down for A.J. Brown, because I don't think that he'll get the 13 because Devonta Smith is there. So you've got to think about all of those things when you're looking at those three players particularly, and you can construct a really good team with Olave and Wilson as a wide receiver 1 or a wide receiver 2, because it means that you have taken either Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, Austin Eckler. Maybe you took Kelsey. You're coming around taking Garrett Wilson. Then you come back around, and it gives you a good chance to take Devonta Smith, or you can take Jahmyr Gibbs, and you've got 1, 2, 3. You've got a pretty decent collection there, but it's volatile. Wilson and Olave are volatile because we don't know how the quarterback situation is going to shake down, and we don't know if they're going to be overused as the primary target, where we see players 1 through 7 on my list being overused as the target. I think their use is just like in the middle. But if they can grow that to 100 receptions, both of them, it's lights out. They could end up top 4 wide receivers, top 5 wide receivers, and supersede some of these guys that we have ahead of them.
Yeah, and on that note, it all came down to the quarterback play, right? So let's ask a realistic question. Is there any chance that Derek Carr is equal to or worse than Andy Dalton?
Oh, he's going to be better than Andy Dalton. But that's the thing about Andy Dalton. Andy Dalton was one of those players that is, I'm going to try to just keep the ball moving, and I'm not going to try to make big plays. And for a guy like Olave, Carr, we know, makes big plays. Last year, he didn't really do that much. He let Adams do that a lot. But Carr can do that. He has the potential to do that. And with a room of wide receivers like he has right now, this is probably his best grouping
of wide receivers that he's had. And also his best grouping of tight ends, probably in terms of just overall talent, not just, Waller being there. So it's a realistic possibility that Carr is going to be a good value in your fantasy drafts, because he's been getting drafted in the likes of like the Sam Howell, below Kirk Cousins range. Incredible value for a guy that could potentially end up as a top 10 quarterback. But in order to get there, the numbers for Olave have to be 7 to 10 touchdowns. The numbers for Thomas have to be 6 to 7 touchdowns. Juwan Johnson has to see about 4 touchdowns. Rashid Shaheed's going to have to see about 5 to 7 touchdowns. And so if you think Carr is going to get to like 26, 27 touchdowns this year, maybe even higher, where are the touchdowns going to go? And so, a couple of them might go to Kamara, a couple of them might go to Miller. So the backfield situation is just a mess. Yeah, the backfield situation is a mess. And so with Carr, is he going to find that Olave is trustworthy for him, is great, is elite? I think yes. And that's why he's at 10. And that's why I have him over guys like DK Metcalf, who we haven't talked about yet, who's not on my list, which would fall. DK would fall around 16, 17 for me.
And I have 12.
Just because when we look at the rooms, I don't think that Michael Thomas or Rashid Shaheed is a big threat to Olave's numbers. But I do think Jackson Smith and Jigba, Tyler Lockett, and DK Metcalf all coming together healthy, there's a very real possibility that we see DK Metcalf's numbers fall a little bit if Jackson Smith goes up. You think it's the opposite. You think he'll take
Lockett. I think Lockett's the one who's going to get hurt in all this.
You think Lockett will get hurt, and I agree with that. But what I will say to that point about DK Metcalf is that I've owned him a couple of years. I'm not dogging him on anything that he can or cannot do on the field. But there have been some games where I've been like, okay, why aren't they giving it to him more? Why? He is the poster boy for me of a wide receiver who has, if he had nobody else on his team to catch the ball, you could see DK Metcalf top 5. But because there's so much competition, they run 2 to 3 running backs out on that field almost all the time. Their tight end sometimes gets those weird targets in the red zone that you think should go to DK Metcalf. Like, there's no reason why Will Dissly should be catching touchdowns in the red zone over DK Metcalf, and that is a fact. And so you've got DK, you've got Tyler, you've got Jackson Smith. The reason why I bring up Jackson Smith is potential red zone targets. Is that if they're covering DK and you're running a 3 wide set at the 5 or at the 10-yard line, and you're trying to spread it a little bit there, who's getting the ball? It's going to be Jackson Smith. Who's getting the ball? It's going to be Kenneth Walker. It's going to be Charbonnet. I'm not saying that he's not going to get the ball in the red zone, and his numbers probably last year lined up where he did get the ball in a red zone a lot. I don't know the numbers right off the top of my head, but with the way that Seattle works, he is the poster child of there are too many good to decent players on his team, and that's why he gets dropped down in these rankings so much. But he's not far off from me than Allen. He's not so far off from me than Ridley. I have them almost in the same capacity.
Yeah, I think Metcalf has the possibility to really blow it up, because when he is there, he's insane. And like I said, I believe that Lockett gets caught up much more with the Smith and Jigba signing than anyone else in that Seattle system. And, I mean, the number one thing is the NFC is so soft. And when we look at just their 4 division games, and then plus the Giants and Washington, they're going to have 6 blowouts on their schedule before we even start. And I believe that Metcalf is going to be a big part of that process. The counterpoint against Metcalf, to let everyone know out there, was Geno Smith had a much slower second half of the year than first half of the year last year. That's a fact. So does that spill over and hold Metcalf back? I'm going to say no because of how talented Metcalf is and the fact that Pete Carroll is not having a quarterback competition this year. He knows his genome the entire offseason, and I believe they're going to build much stronger to their strengths. And
So
I think Metcalf's going to be favorable for him. I think Seattle's going to win a lot of games, and Metcalf's going to drive the bus.
to this point, and to the point that I made about red zone targets is DK Metcalf tied Justin Jefferson in terms of red zone looks last year. Mm-hmm. DK Metcalf only had 6 touchdowns. And to me, that is something that if that goes up, if he's able to get those numbers to go up, that could be really good for DK Metcalf, and you're getting him at a great value in the 3rd round. But I just don't see it because of the way that they play. And there was a couple games last year. I don't know if he was hurt or if they just didn't get him the ball. We had like 1 reception for 3 yards, 1 reception for 15 yards. And then they basically only targeted him 2 more times in the entire game. Like that to me is the most, damning thing about taking DK Metcalf. And particularly if you start with 2 running backs and you're going with DK as your number 1, if you're doing a 3 wide receiver start or a 2 wide receiver start, and say you took AJ Brown, you came back around, or say you took Saquon Barkley, then you took AJ Brown, and then you take DK Metcalf in the 3rd round, that's perfectly fine. I mean, you're giving yourself a little bit of some wiggle room to grow. But I'm going to read you a couple stat lines here. 1 for 2 for 12 yards, 4 for 6 for 35 yards. And this is throughout the whole season. 1 for 5 with 3 yards, 3 for 8 with 40 yards, 8 of 8 for 127 yards. And so like 5 of 6 for 37 yards. So like
he's all over the map. Variability is with him.
It's such a high variable that even when you look at his stats from the year before, let's just pull those up as a comparison for, did Tyler Lockett or whatever hurt him at all? In his best touchdown season, it was 2021 with 12 touchdowns, but he didn't get 1,000 yards. His best season was 2020, where he got 83 receptions, 1,300 yards, and 10 touchdowns. He did that on 83 receptions, right? He's never gotten over 100 receptions, ever, in his career in the NFL. And I don't see that happening this year. And so when you are limiting the amount of receptions that you're going to get, you have to be extremely efficient with the receptions that you do get. And I don't think DK Metcalf is extremely efficient in the way that they use him in terms of receptions. If I'm looking at 3 for 5 and 35 yards, that's showing me that he's maybe getting like 10 yards reception, which is good, but like it's not going, there's no more, as Fantasy Pros said, there's a lot of meat left on the bone when it comes to DK Metcalf. But a lot of that, where is that meat going to go this year? Last year, it was his best potential to go off, and it didn't happen. He had arguably one of his worst touchdown seasons of his career, and an average receiving season in terms of his wide receiver numbers. I think he was ranked wide receiver 17 or wide receiver 27, somewhere in that range. It was very variable on a week-to-week basis. I mean, with that 1 for 3, you might have seen him go at wide receiver 69,
Oh, yeah.
So that's the thing about DK Metcalf, is that I don't think any of the guys that I have listed in my top 15 outside of maybe Keenan Allen will give you that much variability on a week-to-week basis. I think they're going to be pretty steady in terms of their march going on.
They get hurt, they're out.
Right, and you're not going to take him. But DK Metcalf, he's I've owned him in the past, and it's going all the way up to
that same potential vulnerability. I do.
Yeah, there could be that. I think if there's anybody on your list that I would put above DK Metcalf, would be Terry McLaurin, because I think that his targets are pretty much going to be the same on a week-to-week basis. I think he's going to be targeted probably 10 times a game. He might catch 5 to 6 of those. And I think it's going to be pretty steady as the year goes on. But that volatility of DK Metcalf makes me not want to have him as my number one wide receiver if I've taken 2 running backs or a tight end running back combination early. I would play for it as my wide receiver 2. Ideally, if I'm going 3 wide receivers in the first 3 rounds, as a wide receiver 3, I'm very, very comfortable with that. And it's a very realistic possibility if you're drafting in that 7 through 12 or 7 through 10 range in a 10 or 12 team league, that you could build a team that's constructed of Diggs, Wilson, Metcalf. And that, to me, makes your wide receiver core stand out as one that could potentially have three wide receivers that are in the top 15 overall at the end of the season. But then you have to ask yourself, well, what do my running backs look like at that point in time? And at that point in time, you're dealing with a lot of those running backs in the dead zone, the people that do this, they're like, oh, well, you need to take James Conner, you need to take, Rachaad White. But when you take volatility in your wide receiver position, you can't take volatility also at your running back position. You need to have
early, you put yourself in.
You need to have some sort of stability, and that's why starting with a wide receiver, running back, or a running back, wide receiver isn't that bad. And that's where you're probably going to get a team like Bijan Robinson, come back around, get Amon-Ra St. Brown, come back around and get Devonta Smith, Calvin Ridley, or Keenan Allen. And you're probably not going to be that mad about that because there's a very good and realistic chance that all 3 of those players outproduce their ADPs.
No, yeah, absolutely. And let's talk about the guy who's impossible to outpace his ADP. Someone that we just are taking for granted, put him at the number 1 on the list all time, and we saving it for the last episode. The Minnesota native, the big dog, J. Jeff. So, Bob, everyone has J. Jeff being number 1. As you mentioned, number 2 in the NFL last year in target percentage in the red zone. The guy seems like he catches absolutely everything. It's a very stable situation given the fact that we know Cousins is still his quarterback. Cousins is boring, the dad of the NFL, but he feeds J. Jeff, and J. Jeff produces. And not to mention, they just got rid of the main ball carrier in Cook. So we both obviously have J. Jeff being number 1. Why don't we dive through the reasons why he's undisputed number 1, basically across the fantasy landscape?
I mean,
if it doesn't work, what could hold J. Jeff back?
So there really isn't much outside of an injury that's going to hold Jefferson back. If that's an injury to himself or to Kirk Cousins. Outside of that, you're looking at a guy who has gotten progressively 20, this is a weird stat, I never knew that, 20 more receptions every single year he's been in the league. Been in the league 3 years, 88 his first year, 108 the next year, 128 the next year. That is one of the weirdest stats I've ever seen. So you look at it and you say, well, what's gotten better for the Minnesota Vikings? What's gotten worse for the Minnesota Vikings? Well, Adam Thielen is gone. Jordan Addison is in. TJ Hawkinson is in. You also have a running back situation, which, I like Madison, but the more the offseason goes on, the less I really do like Madison. So you go and there's like a couple other running backs there that, they're all kind of average at best. And so you look and say, well, where's this ball going? Well, the ball's going to Justin Jefferson. We all know the ball's going to Justin Jefferson. There were a string of, I think, 4 or 5 games last year where he had 11 to 12 catches. Like, that is 12, 11 points straight out the gate for you in PPR league. That's insane. In last year, he had a low touchdown number, 8. And that was probably from the arrival of Hawkinson. Hawkinson is a threat to his touchdowns. There's no question about it. Hawkinson can break off long runs. He can go for 53 yards. He can go for 30 yards. He is a good thing for Minnesota overall in the red zone. Bad thing for Justin Jefferson when it comes to the red zone. You also have a player who has gotten, this is another weird one too, almost 200 yards better each season. So with those 20 extra receptions each season, that has equated to 200 extra yards. So 10 receptions, 100 yards. Okay. Is there room for Justin Jefferson to grow? Is there a chance that he gets 2,000 yards this year? Absolutely. But that would mean that either he has to be more efficient with the targets that he's given. So he was given 125 targets his first year in the league, 167 in the second year in the league, and 184 the next year in the league. So he didn't catch about 50 of the targets that went his way last year.
Still an insanely high percentage.
Will Kirk Cousins throw him the ball 200 times? Probably. I mean, it's possible that will happen. And will he get to 2,000 yards is a good question. I don't think out of all the wide receivers in the league, he is the most likely for me, based off his progressions and based off of the way that they play. I mean, you're in Minnesota, but you're not outside. You're inside. And the only games outside that they have to worry about are the Packers and the Bears. And the Packers don't have, right? The Packers and the Bears don't have elite back end talent that can really stop Justin Jefferson. And for J. Jeff, you look at it and you say, well, how did he do last year against his divisional opponents, right? Because that's one of the most important things you can look at. Against Chicago, 12 receptions for 154 yards. Right? No touchdowns, though, but 154 yards. And that was at the beginning of the season. Against Detroit, bad game. 3 receptions, 14 yards. Worst game of the year. Outside of his Green Bay game in week 17, where he went 1 for 5 for 15 yards, and week 18. Yeah, and then week 18, he was at Chicago. He went 4 receptions for 38 yards. So Minnesota wasn't really giving him the ball a lot in those 2 games because I think they were resting for the playoffs, right? And so you want your elite talent out there. So there were a couple games last year where he did suck. 3 receptions on 5 targets and 33 yards at Dallas, no touchdowns, right? That week against Detroit, but going back to week 1 against Green Bay, 9 receptions for 184 yards. If you have the potential to get 200 yards receiving in a game, you do deserve to be top 5, right? Oh, yeah. And that's why Devonte Adams is there. That's why Jamar Chase is there. That's why Tyreek Hill is there. That's why Diggs and Jefferson for me is there. They have the very realistic expectation that they could get over 140, 150 receiving yards in a game. And Cooper Kupp could do that too if he's healthy. For Jefferson to not be statistically speaking, drafting Jefferson at the number 1 overall position is going to be diminishing returns for you. Mm-hmm. There is a chance that somebody could do better than him. But I don't see it. I really, if you want the only player that I would take above Jefferson would be Christian McCaffrey. And everybody knows why that's a thing. I wouldn't take Jamar Chase over Justin Jefferson. I've seen that. I did a sleeper draft where Jefferson fell to 4 and I said, what? That's realistically not going to happen ever. But for J. Jeff, he's just so strong across the board that if his growth continues to grow and he gets 20 more receptions, which would then equate to 140 receptions, your baseline is 140 points if that were to happen. That's insane. And then if he doesn't and he goes back to the realistic thing of 100 receptions, we saw what he did with 100 receptions. He got 1,600 yards and 10 touchdowns. That's enough to be wide receiver 1 overall too. So unless he gets hurt, unless Kirk Cousins gets hurt or something stupid happens in Minnesota, realistically, there's nobody that's going to take this number 1 position away from him. And everybody's going to be battling for number 2 if, like I said, nothing stupid happens in Minnesota.
It's well said. We hope that you guys enjoyed our series, guys, of breaking down our PPR rankings. Again, I am Joe. That is Bob up there. And we'll be with you tomorrow, breaking down the the running backs. Running backs will be next, right?
Yeah, I think so. Should be. All right. Did you like how that went better, though?
I think